And welcome to Matter of Theology. My name is David. In the studio with me is Vanilla White Stuff, a.k.a. my brother, Jonathan.
Hello.
Can we please make that stick?
Yes.
Okay.
Vanilla White Stuff.
Okay.
I like it.
Okay. Or should we come up with a new one, like Sean and Gus, every new episode?
Are we going to get sued for plagiarizing?
Maybe. As long as we don't use the same ones.
Sweet, let's do it.
Okay. This is Matter of Theology. Jonathan, I don't know if you knew this, but we have arrived, essentially. Like all the cool kids these days have podcasts. And now that you and I have a podcast, there's literally nothing else in life for us to achieve.
I'm finally cool.
Yeah, I mean, we could retire tomorrow, and we're cool enough. We could start collecting government checks. And,
Sweet.
But we're not going to do that.
That'd be boring.
Because we're not liberals. We actually work for what we have.
It's true.
Yes. Anyway, this podcast is, as you know, called Matter of Theology. Having a podcast has actually been kind of a goal of mine ever since my freshman year at Frontier, which is now 5 years ago. I had bought these really cheap little Samsung Go mics, and I was going to start a podcast with one of my classmates, and that never happened, which I'm kind of sad it didn't, but that is neither there nor here. Gotta talk. And but now we finally have a podcast. We are excited for this and what God is going to do through this. The reason we're calling it Matter of Theology is because through conversations, because the Bible makes it clear, and through conversations that Jonathan and I have had, we believe that all of life, how you live, how you act, how you think, what you do, it's all a matter of theology, what you believe, and how that affects your life. Even our illustrious government has a theology, albeit an errant theology, but they have a theology that affects how they live. It's either a theology of self, rooted in self and what can gratify us and give us more power and money, or it's a theology of God, rooted in His Word and how He has revealed Himself to us. And so this podcast is all about helping you and ourselves develop a robust theology that can withstand time and actually bites back. Jonathan, would you agree that in today's culture, theology has been wimpified?
Oh, yeah.
And churches and Christians, I use that term loosely, have become rather complacent in life, not really caring about what's going on, a lot of times going against exactly what Scripture says, and they're living a wimpified theology that absolutely will crumble.
It's kind of been a frustration of mine that, Christianity, at least in America, is downright pathetic.
Oh, yeah.
The church is pathetic, and Christians are, by and large, pathetic.
Yes.
You don't have to look very far for that.
Yeah. Would you agree that that is probably why we see culture around us disintegrating and spinning off into absolute mayhem and madness is really because the church has failed, and Christians as well?
Yeah. When we depart from how God intended things to work, He made things, He knows how they should work, and when mankind in large departs from that, including the church, and most importantly the church, we find out pretty quickly that, hey, surprise, surprise, God knew what He was talking about.
Yeah, consequences of actions. In that regards, Romans actually talks a lot about that. Maybe we should open up there and discuss where we're hopefully going from here. In Romans chapter 1, Paul makes it pretty clear what the effects are of departing from God and His revealed revelation. Starting in verse 18, we read, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God," I think that's important. Maybe let's stop there. It's important to keep in mind. We look at everything going on around us, and we're tempted to think that they don't believe in the existence of God, and if they did turn from their ways, that would somehow help things. And then in essence, they're right. Obeying God, turning to God, brings blessing and favor of God. But I think we have to keep in mind that they absolutely already know God exists. And it's in their knowing God exists and shoving God out of their mind, suppressing him, that God then releases his wrath, so to speak, on them.
We've kind of let them get away with that.
Yeah.
In that we're like, well, that's your opinion, that's fine.
Right.
We kind of believe them that they don't believe there's a God. Very few people I've come to believe actually don't think there's a God.
Yeah.
They've just told themselves a lie so many times that they've started to believe their own pile of garbage.
Right.
Because it says right there that they knew God. They know him. They know there's a God. And when they stand before God, they have no excuse.
Yeah.
They don't get to say, I didn't know you were real. You didn't give me enough evidence.
Yeah.
And he'll say, yes, I did.
Yeah. And that would affect how we witness other people, how we engage in apologetics. I'm sure we'll get into this topic in a later episode, but that's why I'm a staunch believer, so to speak, in presuppositional apologetics, starting with the basis that God exists, not trying to prove to them that God does, because Romans 1, verse 21 makes it clear they know. And so it's a matter of pressing into that and showing them that they know God exists, and that in their rebellion that they're suppressing that knowledge of God.
And also, well, I don't know all the technical names for it and all of that, but in apologetics, if you make a truth claim apart from what is the norm, it's your job to support that.
Yeah, burden of proof.
Since God has been accepted for thousands of years, or a God, to say that there's no God, it's not our job to prove God to you. It's your job to prove there is no God.
Right.
Which you can't do if you literally look at anything.
Yeah.
Ever looked in a mirror?
Yeah. Yeah. And they know. So Paul continues on, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they become fools. Man, that sounds familiar. And exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore, verse 24, God gave them over to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature, rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God has given them over to degrading passions, for the women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural, and in the same way, the men abandoned the natural function of the woman, and burned in their desire towards one another, men with men committing indecent acts, and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Now, I find it interesting. I was listening to another podcast, and they pointed out, they were talking about a similar topic, but they pointed out, like, often we think that all this homosexuality, this sexual perversion that we see going on, is going to induce God's wrath upon us. But when we read this text, we see that, yes, there are cases in which sin brings the wrath of God. It does always bring the wrath of God, but often the sin is the wrath of God. And this is what we see here. The giving over of them to unnatural passions, homosexuality, is not what is going to incur the judgment of God. It is the very judgment of God itself, and it just spins humanity, cultures, countries, nations into absolute chaos, and that is exactly what we see going on here. And so our desire in this podcast is to speak into this darkness that we see around us, and to use the gifts, talents, and desires that God has given us to reach the nations with the gospel. I think a verse that I wish more Christians understood was Matthew 28:18 through 20. And we all know this verse, this passage. It's talking about, this is the Great Commission passage. And starting in verse 18, it says, "And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, 'All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth.'" And a lot of Christians, like, we read that how many times? But we often think, okay, all authority has been given to Jesus, and we think in the heavenly realm, which is true, but we forget, and we don't read the next part of the verse, or at least don't take it to heart, that not only does Jesus have all authority in heaven, but he also has been given all authority on earth. Verse 19, "Go therefore," therefore referring back to the fact that all authority has been given, so we go forth into the world because all authority has been given to Jesus in heaven and on earth, and we make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. A lot of times, we as Christians, we think, okay, in going, we're going to go to the nations, so let's just take China or Brazil or one of these other countries out there. We're going to go to those countries, and we're going to make disciples within those countries, and we're going to get Christians. But that's not what the text says. It doesn't say to go to the nations and get some disciples from them. Jesus commanded us to make disciples of the nations. And there is a vast difference between going to a nation and getting disciples from them and going to a nation and making a disciple of that nation. And yet that is exactly what Jesus commanded us here. We're not just to go to China, to Brazil, to Iraq, to Russia, and to get disciples from them. We are to go to those nations, and we are to make disciples of the nation as a whole. Massive mandate, tall order. He goes on, we're to baptize them. Well, let's talk about disciples first of all. Let's break that down a little bit more. We often forget this part, right? He says to go and make disciples, and yet subconsciously we think, well, we just need to go and share the gospel. But it's implied there, because to have disciples, you have to have the gospel shared. But what Jesus is telling us is we don't stop at just sharing the gospel. We're to make disciples. And if we have not made disciples, the job's not done yet. And so it's not just sharing the gospel. We're not just out to get people professing the name of Christ. We're to make disciples. What are disciples? Making disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So we baptize them, and to teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. In essence, to teach them obedience. That's what a disciple is. And it's not just going into those nations, getting some disciples, and then coming out. We're to go in, and we're to make disciples of the nations. That is a tall order, and I think one that's often missed by Christians. But if we're to be obedient to what Jesus has commanded us, we're not just to go into the nations and to get disciples. We're to make disciples of the nations, ours included. Now, whether America continues on and we get the chance to see America becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ, I pray that would happen. Certainly not in our lifetime, but let's just say America falls away and another nation rises up in its place. God's command is that that nation, whatever it is, whenever it comes, would be made a disciple of Jesus Christ. Go ahead.
And keeping in mind that this is a disciple of Jesus, because too often we go in and we make disciples of ourselves. Right? We go in and we want to build an American church in the Amazon jungle.
Yeah.
It's a disciple of Jesus, not a disciple of ourselves.
Yeah.
There can be a church, a local church can look differently than the country of whoever came and made those disciples. We're not making disciples of ourselves. We're not making disciples of the American church. We're making a disciple of Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so that is our desire in this podcast. That is our mission, is to, in the sphere that God has placed us in, we're here in Utah, and my prayer, my heart, is to see that one day Utah would become a disciple of Jesus Christ. Tall order.
Really tall order.
Yeah. Yes. And I do not foresee that is going to happen in my lifetime.
But who knows? It might.
It very well could.
I mean, God is the one who brought thousands to him in a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe that's not the norm of today, but hey, he's still God. He can still do whatever he wants.
Yeah, it certainly could happen, and I don't want to say it couldn't. But keep in mind, I mean, those of us who are here in Utah and seeking to see the state, the people brought to Jesus Christ, we didn't start here afresh, right? We're building on the foundation of the missionaries that went before us, who laid that foundation, and then we're building on what they built, and we're continuing on with the mission, the mandate of making disciples. And we should not live in such a way where we think that we're the last generation that's going to be here. We should think multi-generationally, to live like we're going to have grandchildren and that their children are going to have children. My heart's desire, well, I don't think that in my lifetime I'll see Utah come to be a disciple of Christ. It could, but my goal is to lay the foundation for my kids and their kids if God keeps them here in Utah. If he moves them on, fine. But if they're going to be here in Utah, whoever comes after me, I want them to have a foundation upon which they can build. And so we're blazing the trail, so to speak, and yes, making disciples, but also building a foundation upon which others can come after us. And so we need to think multi-generationally, and that's how we need to play the long game.
And that's even kind of where we are already as a church as a whole. I mean, we're now building on the foundation that was laid 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And has been being built on for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And we have the early church fathers and their works and the apostles and what they did. I mean, we're still building on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though they firmly believed Jesus was coming back in their own lifetime. They kind of had that balance where, yes, he could come back, but he could also tarry.
Yeah.
So there's both.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to avoid, and I'm sure we'll discuss this later on. I'm not introducing this topic to thus take a tangent, but I'm sure we'll talk about later. Dispensational theology and its attached eschatology. But for better or for worse, and I realize there's different flavors there, but one of the things that discourages me as I look at that movement is there tends to be an escapist theology where, well, we're going to be raptured out anyway, so why live a certain way?
Yeah, because Jesus told us to.
Yes, exactly. And so we want to avoid living in a mindset where Jesus is coming back, which he is. He's going to judge the living and the dead, but we're not to live in a way where expecting that to happen to the point where we just fail to do what Jesus has commanded us.
We don't lock the doors and sit on top of the roof waiting for him.
Right, exactly.
Until he does come back, we best be being about what he's told us to do.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that is the goal, that is the desire of Matter of Theology, is to, first of all, make a disciple of Utah, where we're placed, of America, of the world, to see it come to the obedience of Jesus Christ, and starting small, and like what we're doing right here, and doing what we can to be obedient to the call that Jesus has given us. And we're going to be growing from a podcast. Jonathan and I and my wife have been discussing several different business ideas that could be used to, again, fulfill this Great Commission. I can't really talk about any details yet, but I'm very excited about some of the prospects that are taking shape, that we're exploring right now, and of course we'll be announcing them as they come, should the Lord continue to lead in this way. So excited about that, but for now we're just going to be doing the podcast, and I haven't talked to Jonathan yet about this, so surprise, but I thought it would be cool if, obviously we have this podcast, but what if we did some like sideshows, so to speak? So we have like the main Matter of Theology podcast, but we could do a Matter in Theology news edition, where we talk about current news events from a Christian worldview. We could talk about matter of theology and business or media, whatever that looks like taking different things that we're interested in and talking about them from a biblical theological perspective. And I think that could be good. Yeah. So we could talk about that. It doesn't need to be anything super big. It could just be like a 10-minute deal every week, whatever. But I think that could be very beneficial. Where you can find us. So right now, we're going to be on YouTube, obviously, and I thoroughly expect us to be kicked off.
I hope so.
I know.
That'd be fun.
Yes. We do not intend on pulling any punches. This is not a time in the world and life to be cautious. We have to be...
Go totally Paul on them. And
yes.
The early church fathers who completely, slapped some heretics.
That's true. Yeah. Good old Saint Nick. Maybe we should talk about Saint Nick sometime.
Did I tell you I used him as an illustration in my last sermon?
Mm-mm. I like it.
Yep.
I actually...
Good stuff.
So we're not going to be... we're not going to be pulling any punches. We're going to speak the truth in love, but oftentimes people have too much love and not enough truth. And that's not going to be what we're seeking to do. We're going to be gentle, as Scripture commands us to. But one thing that I think, unfortunately, people... we take gentleness to the extreme. Jesus being the epitome of gentleness, oftentimes spoke very authoritatively. And so Ephesians chapter 4, in unity amongst brothers, we're to be gentle. And I talked about this on Sunday in my sermon. There are seasons in being gentle, as Jesus has commanded us. There are seasons to enter the temple as Jesus didn't start flipping tables.
Right. I mean, you see that in Jesus, in Paul, in different people throughout church history, Luther, and they were gentle at some times, and then other times they were just absolute savage beasts, and I love it.
Yeah. And we also often think that somehow gentleness and speaking the truth are somehow dichotomous to one another, and they're not. They go hand in hand. So there are times, and I foresee them coming very quickly on this podcast. There are times to enter the temple as Jesus did, start flipping tables. There are times to open your mouth and call someone a brood of vipers, whitewashed tombs, or sons of Satan. Jesus did that. There are times to use shocking language like the prophets did and tell people that all their righteous deeds are like bloodied menstrual claws, and that's exactly what the prophet Isaiah meant when he said that all of our righteous deeds are filthy rags. Being gentle does not mean that we're pushovers with no spine and could care less if people are getting run over by godless brutes. Those times were the exceptions. Like, it's not to be the norm. We're just walking in and flipping tables, right? They're the exception. Last resort, not the reaction of the first rule. But there are those times where you have to step out and you have to be courageous and speak the truth in love, but still speak the truth even though it's rather uncomfortable, both for you and the hearer.
It's all about who's being the offense.
Right.
Am I being the offense, or is the gospel being the offense?
Absolutely.
If the gospel's being the offense, good. I'm glad you're offended.
Yes.
Here, let me offend you some more.
Yes. Exactly. See?
Because that means it's working.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. So I don't expect to be on YouTube for long. I mean, as long as God keeps us there, we'll post and we'll be on there. But I'm also looking at other platforms upon which we can disseminate our content. We are working on getting it syndicated to iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all those. You can find them there. Hopefully I'll have to get it set up. But once we get this episode posted, it should automatically show up on all those platforms, so you can find us there. We're also going to be exploring some alternative platforms, again, because I'd like to be censorship resilient. I'm sure it's coming, but there are plenty of platforms that are popping up that are going to allow us to stay on and continue to publish our content, even while the godless commies are running amok.
Hey, and if they kick us off of them all, well, we'll just make our own platform.
Exactly. And we're going to talk about that, because why in the past few generations have there been so few Christian technologists, inventors, investors who have not stepped up to the platform and invented their own social media sites? Like, why have we not seen that? And
because we're lazy.
Yeah.
And we look at it and just take it lying down.
Yes.
Instead of, actually stomping that fire out when it got started.
Yes.
Instead of letting it grow to a blaze before
Right.
we're like, hey, maybe we should do something about this.
Exactly. Historically, Christians have been the inventors of all major platforms. Like, a lot of the inventions that history have benefited from, that we're still benefiting from and sharing the blessings of fruit in, were invented by Christians. And the Christian inventors, investors, businessmen, technologists, we've stopped building, and it's time to stop building and to start building like absolute mad, because we're going to need it.
And most of the stuff that even we have as commonplace right now were started by Christians.
Yeah.
I remember reading freshman year How Christianity Changed the World. I don't remember who wrote it, but
Yeah.
talked about hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
How the idea of helping those who were sick was kind of foreign.
Yeah.
In that culture. You were sick, well, tough on you.
Right.
You're going to die, and oh well, whatever.
Yeah.
And then Christianity came in and said, no, we're going to help these people. And you see that with a lot of different things. Some things that I didn't know had a Christian foundation. And it was Christians who started it.
Yeah. So, all that to say, a little bit of a sidetrack. We're going to be talking about that more, but we're going to be getting ourselves into some alternative platforms. The first one that we're going to be getting onto is Telegram. It's a semi-social media, semi-messaging platform. It's by a Ukrainian dude who's funded the whole project with his own money. I'm not saying it's the best free speech platform, but it seems to be working pretty well. I've been using it for a while, and I like it, and it seems to be a lot more free speech respecting than other platforms. And so I have I guess it's called a Matter of Theology channel set up on Telegram. So you can go there and you can follow us. We'll be releasing updates, articles. I think we'll also consider releasing the actual raw audio and video on here so people can download it that way if all else fails. So you can find that there. I would encourage you to follow that. It's probably going to be our main platform for pushing out updates, but we'll also talk about other stuff like Facebook and Twitter and all those other nasty places.
Fake book.
Yes, we're there because that's where the people are, not because we really want to be. So all that to say, stay tuned. We've got a lot of great stuff coming up. We are excited. We have a couple different topics that we're trying to think through about what we want to discuss as of first importance or first matter. We were going to talk about divine impassibility, as my brother and I mean, like, why start something unless you're going to do it hard? So we were
that's kind of how we've done things in the past.
Oh yeah,
anyway.
all the time. So we were going to start with divine impassibility, and we still might. But with everything going on in the world, we also considered starting out with talking about Protestant resistance theory, how Christians relate to tyrannical governments, and when is it right to stand up and say no. And so we might talk about that. We might talk about divine simplicity. We still have to pray through that and hash all that out. But whatever the case, there's going to be some great episodes coming out, and we would encourage you to tune in. Jonathan, anything else you want to add before we close out?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, I do want to thank you guys for tuning in. We are extremely excited to see what God is going to do. And with that said, thank you for listening to Matter of Theology. Until next time, love God, love neighbor, be courageous, resist tyranny, stay free. Until the whole world knows and he returns, go conquer.